Max froze mid-stride, his small body trembling as the horrific scene unfolded before him. The 18-foot Burmese python had coiled around Bella like a living nightmare, her desperate whimpers barely audible through the massive serpent's crushing embrace. This wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not to her. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor as Tom's radio crackled with emergency calls. Eleanor's weathered hands clutched her chest, the foreclosure notice forgotten as her granddaughter's screams echoed from 5 years past. Bella's gentle brown eyes, the same ones that had watched over Max through countless nightmares, now pleaded for salvation from a creature that shouldn't exist in their peaceful Oregon sanctuary. The golden afternoon light filtered through Douglas firs, casting shadows that made the python's scales shimmer like death itself. "Get the tranquilizer gun!" Tom's voice shattered the paralysis. But Max was already moving, his 8-month-old heart pounding with a courage he didn't know he possessed. What could one small puppy do against such ancient evil? And why did this feel like destiny rather than accident? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Max had arrived at the Wilson Animal Sanctuary as broken as any creature Sarah had ever treated. The 8-month-old German Shepherd puppy bore invisible scars deeper than the faded brand mark hidden beneath his black and tan coat. His previous owner, a man named Jake Morrison who ran an underground dogfighting ring in Portland, had used Max as a bait dog, a living punching bag to train fighters. When the police raided Morrison's operation, they found Max cowering in a wire cage, too traumatized to bark. Tom Wilson had been the responding Forest Service officer that day, his own PTSD from Iraq recognizing the hollow look in the puppy's eyes. "This one's coming home with us," he told Sarah, despite their small house already sheltering 12 rescue animals. Sarah, a former veterinarian who'd left her practice after losing their unborn child in a car accident 3 years prior, saw in Max the same desperate need for healing she carried in her own heart. Bella had become Max's salvation. The 4-year-old German Shepherd, a retired search and rescue dog with partial hearing loss from an explosion during a mountain rescue, possessed an intuitive understanding of damaged souls. She'd taken Max under her protection immediately, teaching him that not all human hands brought pain, that food would always be available, that safety existed in this world. The Wilson Sanctuary sat on 15 acres of pristine Oregon wilderness, 2 miles from the small town of Cedar Falls. Their modest 2-story farmhouse, built in 1978, overlooked rolling meadows where horses from the county's animal control grazed peacefully. A red barn housed exotic birds recovered from illegal trafficking, while a series of heated outbuildings provided temporary homes for everything from abandoned raccoon kits to injured deer. Sarah's relationship with her mother-in-law Eleanor had remained strained since the tragedy that claimed 7-year-old Emma Mitchell 5 years ago. Eleanor, the former head zookeeper at Oregon Zoo, lived alone in the family's 1950s farmhouse just down Maple Creek Road. At 72, she survived on Social Security payments that barely covered her medications for high blood pressure and a weak heart. The foreclosure notice she'd received that morning represented the final blow to a woman who'd lost everything: her career, her son Robert's respect, and her will to connect with the living world. Robert Mitchell, Sarah's brother-in-law, had once been Tom's closest friend and colleague at the zoo. The two men had shared a passion for wildlife conservation until the day Robert's daughter Emma died from a python bite during what should have been a routine educational visit. The tragedy had transformed Robert from a gentle veterinarian into something harder, angrier. Now he operated on the margins of legality, trapping and relocating dangerous animals for private collectors who paid top dollar for exotic specimens. None of them understood that their separate griefs had been slowly weaving together, drawing them toward this moment when a puppy's courage would force them to confront the truth about family, forgiveness, and the redemptive power of love that transcends species. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in late September, with Sarah Wilson standing at her kitchen window watching Max and Bella play in the golden meadow behind their house. The coffee maker gurgled softly as she opened the stack of bills that had arrived with the mail, veterinary supplies, feed costs, and the ever-present reminder that running an animal sanctuary on a forest ranger's salary meant living paycheck to paycheck. "You're up early," Tom said, emerging from their bedroom in his ranger uniform, dark circles under his eyes betraying another restless night. His PTSD had been acting up lately, triggered by the approaching anniversary of his unit's ambush in Fallujah. "Couldn't sleep." Sarah turned away from the window, hiding the medical envelope she'd slipped beneath the pile. Dr. Martinez's office had called twice yesterday about her test results, but she couldn't bring herself to hear words that might shatter what little stability they'd built. "The animals need their morning feeding anyway." Tom poured himself coffee and watched their small pack through the window. Besides Max and Bella, they currently housed 3 cats recovered from a hoarding situation, 2 horses with trust issues, and a family of raccoons whose mother had been killed by a car. "Sarah, we need to talk about the financial situation. I've been looking at the numbers and we can't keep taking in every animal that needs help." "They have nowhere else to go." Her voice carried an edge that made Tom look up sharply. "These animals depend on us." "I know, but we're drowning. The feed bills alone are killing us, and winter's coming. Maybe we could find homes for some of the easier cases, keep the ones that really need specialized care." Sarah's hands trembled as she poured her coffee. The thought of giving up any of their animals felt like betraying her purpose, the only thing that gave meaning to her days since losing the baby. "Max and Bella stay?" "No matter what." "Of course they stay. I'm talking about—" The conversation was interrupted by Tom's radio crackling to life. "Ranger Wilson, we've got reports of illegal trap activity near the Cascade Creek Trail. Possible exotic animal poaching. Can you respond?" Tom grabbed his gear bag, the familiar weight of duty pushing their domestic concerns aside. "I'll be back by noon." "We'll figure this out, Sarah. We always do." After he left, Sarah walked outside to begin the morning routine that kept her grounded. Max bounded toward her with his characteristic enthusiasm, though she noticed he still flinched slightly when she reached too quickly for his collar. Some scars never fully healed. "Come on, babies," she called to Max and Bella. "Let's go check on everyone else." The barn was Sarah's sanctuary within their sanctuary. Here, surrounded by the soft sounds of animals beginning their day, she could almost forget the weight of secrets she carried. The 3 cats, Whiskers, Shadow, and Princess, wound around her legs as she filled their food bowls. The horses, Thunder and Lightning, nickered softly from their stalls, their rehabilitation from years of neglect progressing slowly but steadily. Max had developed a routine of his own, making rounds to each animal as if taking attendance. His intelligence never ceased to amaze Sarah. Despite his traumatic past, he seemed to understand that his role here was protector and comforter to creatures even more damaged than himself. Bella followed at a more sedate pace, her partial deafness making her rely heavily on visual cues. She'd learned to read Max's body language perfectly, understanding when he sensed something amiss before she could hear it herself. As they finished the morning chores, Sarah noticed Max becoming increasingly agitated. He kept running to the edge of their property line, looking toward the forest, then returning to her side with worried whines. "What is it, boy?" She followed his gaze toward the tree line where Cascade Creek wound through their land. "Bella, stay close." But Bella was already moving toward the forest with unusual determination, her nose working the air. Max danced anxiously beside Sarah, clearly torn between following his surrogate mother and staying to protect his human. "Bella, come back!" Sarah called, but the older dog had disappeared into the undergrowth, following some scent that had captured her attention completely. Max let out a sound Sarah had never heard from him before, a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry all the grief of his short life. Then he was running, crashing through the ferns and salmonberry bushes, following Bella's trail. "Max! Bella!" Sarah's voice echoed through the forest as she gave chase, her heart hammering with a premonition of disaster. Branches caught at her clothes and scratched her face as she followed the sounds of Max's increasingly frantic barking. The forest grew darker as she moved deeper into the old-growth timber, the canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the mossy ground. Somewhere ahead, she could hear water running over rocks, Cascade Creek, where Tom had said the illegal traps were reported. And then, cutting through the peaceful sounds of the forest, came a sound that froze her blood, Bella's scream of pain and terror. Sarah crashed through the undergrowth, following the sound of Max's increasingly desperate barking. Her lungs burned as she navigated fallen logs and thick patches of Oregon grape, their thorny leaves tearing at her jeans. The familiar forest path seemed different now, threatening as shadows lengthened despite the morning hour. When she finally broke through a wall of salmonberry bushes into a small clearing beside Cascade Creek, the scene before her defied comprehension. Bella lay motionless near the water's edge, her body partially wrapped by what appeared to be the largest snake Sarah had ever seen outside of a zoo. The massive Burmese python, easily 18 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had coiled around Bella's chest and hindquarters. Max stood 10 feet away, his small body rigid with terror and determination. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't abandon the dog who had become his mother, his protector, his entire world. His puppy bark echoed off the surrounding Douglas firs as he darted forward and back, trying to find an opening to help without becoming the python's next victim. "Oh, God! Oh, God!" Sarah whispered, her veterinary training warring with maternal panic. She fumbled for her cell phone, but the dense canopy blocked any signal. Tom's radio was back at the house. They were alone with a predator that could kill them all. The python's head, massive and triangular, turned toward the sound of her voice. Its black eyes, cold and ancient, seemed to assess this new threat. Sarah could see Bella's rib cage rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. The snake wasn't constricting fully yet. It seemed almost hesitant, as if something about this situation puzzled it. Max chose that moment to launch himself forward, his teeth finding purchase on the python's thick tail. The snake's head whipped around with lightning speed, but Max was already dancing backward, his fighting dog instincts serving him well. He barked once, sharp and commanding, as if calling for backup that would never come. Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about large constrictors. Attacking the head would be suicide. The snake was positioned partially in the shallow creek, which might limit its mobility. But one wrong move and it could crush Bella's ribcage or strike out at Max with enough force to break the puppy's spine. "Easy, baby," she called to Max, trying to keep her voice calm despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Back away slowly." But Max wasn't listening. Something in his damaged psyche had been triggered. Perhaps the sight of another innocent creature being hurt, perhaps the echo of his own helplessness in Morrison's fighting ring. He lunged forward again, this time grabbing the python behind its head, his small jaws clamped with the desperation of the dying. The snake's reaction was immediate and violent, its massive body uncoiled from Bella as it tried to reach Max, who had positioned himself perfectly, close enough to attack, far enough to avoid the strike, using the very agility that had kept him alive in the fighting pits. Bella gasped and rolled away from the creek, alive but clearly injured. Sarah started toward her but stopped as the python's attention shifted entirely to Max. The puppy had bought them time, but at what cost? "Max, run!" Sarah screamed, but the dog seemed locked in a battle that transcended his 8 months of life. This was about more than saving Bella. This was about proving that victims could become protectors, that the smallest creature could stand against monsters. The python struck with prehistoric speed, but Max's reflexes, honed by months of dodging blows and attacks, served him well. He rolled aside, the snake's head hitting the rocky creek bank where he'd been standing. Immediately, he was back on his feet, harassing the enormous reptile with the persistence of a creature that had nothing left to lose. Sarah realized with growing horror that Max was winning through sheer determination and intelligence. He was using the terrain, rocks, fallen logs, the creek itself, to stay just beyond the python's reach while landing quick bites that, while not deadly, were clearly frustrating the massive snake. But the puppy was tiring. His movements were becoming less precise. His breathing labored. The python, ancient and patient, seemed to sense this. It began to move more strategically, using its length to cut off Max's escape routes. That's when Sarah heard the sound that made her blood run cold. Multiple vehicles approaching through the forest, engines revving as they navigated the rough terrain. Someone was coming, but whether as friend or foe remained terrifyingly unclear. The first to break through the tree line was a man Sarah recognized with a mixture of relief and dread. Robert Mitchell, her brother-in-law, emerged from a battered pickup truck carrying what appeared to be professional snake-handling equipment. Behind him came 2 other men she didn't recognize, their faces hard and businesslike. "Sarah, get away from that thing!" Robert shouted, but his voice carried something beyond concern, an edge of excitement that made her stomach turn. "That's exactly what we've been tracking." Max, distracted by the arrival of humans, made a crucial error. He turned his head toward the voices for just a moment, and the python struck. Its massive coils wrapped around the puppy before he could react, and Max's brave barking turned into a yelp of pain and terror. "No!" Sarah lunged forward without thinking, but Robert caught her arm. "Don't be stupid," he said, his grip surprisingly strong. "That snake's worth more alive than dead. These buyers pay premium for breeding-age Burmese pythons." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Buyers? Robert, what are you talking about? That thing could have killed Bella. It's going to kill Max." Robert's face, weathered by 5 years of grief and anger, showed no emotion as he watched Max struggle in the python's coils. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. That snake doesn't belong here anyway. This is business, Sarah. One of Robert's companions, a thin man with calculating eyes, stepped forward with a long pole topped by a metal loop. "Boss, if we're going to take this python, we need to move fast." "That puppy's making too much noise. Might attract rangers." Sarah stared at her brother-in-law, seeing him clearly for the first time. This wasn't about protecting the community from dangerous animals. This was about money, about revenge dressed up as righteousness. And Max, brave, damaged, loyal Max, was about to pay the price for Robert's twisted sense of justice. As the python's coils tightened around the puppy and his struggles grew weaker, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She broke free from Robert's grip and ran toward the creek, screaming for Tom, for anyone who might hear, knowing that in the next few minutes, either Max would be saved or they would all learn just how far Robert Mitchell had fallen into darkness. Sarah's scream echoed through the forest canopy as she lunged toward Max, but Robert's partner, a wiry man with prison tattoos covering his forearms, intercepted her with practiced efficiency. "Easy there, lady. Let the professionals handle this." "Max!" Sarah fought against the man's grip, watching helplessly as the python's coils tightened around the puppy. Max's eyes, wide with terror but still defiant, found hers across the clearing. Even in the face of death, he wasn't giving up. The sound of Tom's truck engine roaring through the forest broke the horrific tableau. Within seconds, he burst through the tree line, his ranger uniform torn from navigating the brush at speed. His eyes took in the scene. Sarah restrained by a stranger, Robert directing two men with snake-handling equipment, and Max wrapped in the deadly embrace of a massive python. "What the hell is going on here?" Tom's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon, his military training overriding years of civilian life. "Robert, step away from that animal. Now!" Robert raised his hands in a gesture of false calm. "Tom, buddy, you need to understand. This snake is worth $50,000 to the right collector. It's been terrorizing livestock for months. We're doing everyone a favor." "By letting it kill Max?" Tom's voice carried the cold edge Sarah had only heard when he woke from nightmares about Iraq. "Release my wife. Now!" The tattooed man looked to Robert, who nodded reluctantly. Sarah stumbled forward, her eyes never leaving Max. The puppy had stopped struggling, but she could see his chest still rising and falling. He was conserving his strength, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. That's when the forest erupted with the sound of another vehicle approaching, this one moving with less urgency but more authority. Eleanor Mitchell's ancient Buick emerged from the tree line like a boat cutting through green water, and the 72-year-old woman stepped out with a dignity that commanded attention despite her house dress and worn cardigan. "Robert David Mitchell." Eleanor's voice carried 40 years of maternal authority. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Robert's face flushed with the embarrassment of a child caught misbehaving. "Mom, this doesn't concern you. Go home. That animal concerns me very much." Eleanor walked past the men with their equipment, past Tom with his hand on his weapon, and stopped at the creek's edge where she could look directly at the python. "Serena, what are you doing so far from home?" The effect on the massive snake was immediate and stunning. The python's head lifted and its coils loosened slightly around Max. A sound emerged from its throat, not a hiss, but something almost like recognition. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Robert demanded, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "How do you know that snake?" Eleanor knelt beside the creek, her arthritic joints protesting but her voice remaining gentle. "Because I raised her from a hatchling 23 years ago at the zoo. Serena was part of our educational program until—" Her voice broke. "Until the day Emma died." The clearing fell silent except for the sound of running water and Max's labored breathing. Sarah felt the world shift around her as pieces of a puzzle she didn't know existed began falling into place. "You're lying," Robert said, but the certainty had drained from his voice. "That snake killed my daughter." "No, son." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that had been building for 5 years. "I killed your daughter. I was the one who forgot to secure Serena's enclosure that morning. I was the one who was too distracted by budget meetings and personnel reviews to double-check the lock. Emma wandered into the reptile house while I was in my office, and Serena was just being what she was, a confused, defensive animal in an unfamiliar situation." Sarah watched Robert's face crumble as the foundation of his anger was pulled away. "But you told me it was an aggressive animal, that it should have been destroyed." "I lied to protect myself," Eleanor whispered. "I was a coward who let my son destroy his life hunting innocent animals because I couldn't face the truth about my own negligence. Every python you've trapped, every animal you've hurt, that blood is on my hands." Tom holstered his weapon and moved slowly toward the creek. His PTSD had taught him to recognize trauma in all its forms, and he could see it radiating from every person in this clearing. "Eleanor, why is the snake here? Why now?" Eleanor looked at Serena with the expression of someone greeting an old friend. "Because this is where she's always nested." The zoo was built on her ancestral territory. When she escaped during that storm 2 years ago, she came home. She paused, studying the python's behavior more closely. "And unless I'm mistaken, she's pregnant and very close to giving birth." As if summoned by Eleanor's words, Serena began to move again, but not aggressively. She was releasing Max, her coils unwrapping with careful deliberation. The puppy collapsed to the creek bank, gasping but alive, his eyes still fixed on the massive snake with a mixture of fear and something that looked almost like understanding. "She wasn't attacking the dog," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing in familiar expertise. "She was protecting him. Look at the positioning." She wrapped around the dog to shield him from something else. Sarah followed Eleanor's gaze and saw what they had all missed in their panic. Scattered around the clearing were spring-loaded leg traps, the kind used for large predators. One was positioned exactly where Bella had been walking when the python intervened. Another was hidden beneath fallen leaves near the path Max would have taken to help his surrogate mother. "Robert," Tom's voice was deadly quiet. "Did you set traps on my property?" Robert's face had gone pale. The traps were for the snake. I didn't know. Bella must have wandered into the kill zone while I was setting up." "You could have killed them both." Sarah's voice shook with rage and relief. "Your own traps would have killed them, and this snake you've been hunting, saved their lives." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Robert had spent 5 years seeking revenge against pythons for his daughter's death, only to discover that a python had just saved the lives of the animals his own actions had endangered. Max struggled to his feet, wobbling slightly but determined to reach Sarah. She scooped him into her arms, feeling his small heart hammering against her chest. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." But the crisis wasn't over. Serena had moved to a depression in the creek bank where fallen logs created a natural shelter. Her massive body was contracting rhythmically, and even from a distance they could see the first of what would be many eggs beginning to emerge. "She's giving birth," Eleanor said unnecessarily. "She needs space and quiet, or she could become defensive again." Robert's men had been standing in uncomfortable silence throughout the family revelations, but now the one with calculating eyes stepped forward. "Boss, python eggs are worth even more than the adult. We're talking about $250,000 if she lays a full clutch." Robert looked at his employee as if seeing him for the first time. 5 years of anger had led him down a path where he surrounded himself with people who saw dollar signs instead of living creatures. "Get off this property, both of you. Now." "But boss, I said leave." Robert's shout echoed off the trees, and his 2 companions reluctantly gathered their equipment and departed, grumbling about lost opportunities and broken contracts. As the sound of their vehicle faded, a new tension settled over the clearing. Tom was studying the scattered traps with professional attention. "Robert, I have to report this. Illegal trapping on federal land, endangered species violations. You're looking at serious federal charges." "I know." Robert sat heavily on a fallen log, looking older than his 50 years. "I've known for a long time that what I was doing was wrong. I couldn't stop. Every time I saw a python, I saw Emma's face." Eleanor approached her son with the careful movements of someone crossing a minefield. "Robert, Emma's death was my fault, not theirs, not yours. If you want to hate someone, hate me." "I tried to hate you," Robert said quietly, "but you're my mother." "So I hated them instead." He gestured toward Serena, who was now fully engaged in the birthing process. "It was easier than facing the truth." Sarah felt her phone buzzing and realized with shock that they had been in the clearing for over an hour. The outside world was trying to intrude on this moment of revelation and reckoning. She glanced at the screen and saw Dr. Martinez's number, her cancer test results. The irony struck her like a physical blow. Here she was, in the middle of a crisis involving life and death, holding the dog who had just risked everything to save his family, while her own medical results waited to potentially shatter her world. Max looked up at her with complete trust, as if he knew she would protect him just as fiercely as he had protected Bella. "Tom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." But before she could continue, the sound of sirens began echoing through the forest. Someone, probably Robert's fleeing employees, had called the authorities. Within minutes, they would have to deal with fish and wildlife officers, possibly FBI agents specializing in wildlife crimes, and a media circus that would turn their private moment of healing into a public spectacle. Eleanor stood up straighter, her shoulders squaring with resolve. "I'm going to tell them the truth, all of it. About Emma, about my negligence, about Robert's hunting. It's time. Mom, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Eleanor's voice carried the strength of someone who had finally found her moral center after years of drift. "I've let my cowardice hurt too many people for too long. That stops today." Serena had laid 6 eggs in the natural nest she'd created, her massive body curved protectively around them. Despite everything that had happened, she was completing the cycle that had brought her to this place, the ancient imperative to reproduce and protect her young. Max struggled out of Sarah's arms and, to everyone's amazement, walked slowly toward the python. Serena's head rose, watching the puppy approach, but there was no aggression in her posture. Max stopped just out of striking distance and lay down, positioning himself between Serena and the approaching sirens. It was a moment of pure instinct transcending species, 2 mothers protecting their young, one natural and one chosen, finding common ground in the universal language of sacrifice and love. The sirens grew louder, and Tom began gathering the scattered traps as evidence. Robert sat in contemplative silence, perhaps finally understanding that his 5-year quest for revenge had been built on a foundation of lies and misdirected grief. And Sarah, still holding her phone with its waiting message of potential doom, realized that sometimes the most important truths emerge not from medical tests or official reports, but from the simple recognition that love, whether between humans, between animals, or between species, is worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. The first law enforcement vehicle to reach the clearing was Fish and Wildlife Officer Jenny Chen's white SUV, its government plates and official markings announcing the arrival of federal authority. Officer Chen emerged with the practiced calm of someone who had seen every possible variation of human stupidity involving protected wildlife, but even her experienced eyes widened at the scene before her. A massive Burmese python lay coiled around a clutch of freshly laid eggs, while a German shepherd puppy maintained what could only be described as a protective vigil nearby. An elderly woman knelt beside the creek as if she were attending a birth, which Chen realized she essentially was. 2 men stood with the rigid posture of people expecting to be arrested, while a younger woman clutched her phone with white knuckles. "Nobody move," Chen commanded, her hand resting on the tranquilizer gun at her belt. "I need someone to explain this situation very slowly and very clearly." Tom stepped forward, his ranger credentials visible on his uniform. "Officer Chen, I'm Tom Wilson, Forest Service. This is my property, and we have a complicated situation involving illegal trapping, an endangered python giving birth, and some family issues that need to be resolved." "Endangered?" Robert's voice cracked with disbelief. "That thing isn't endangered, it's invasive. Florida's been dealing with them for decades." Eleanor raised her head from her position by the python, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Serena isn't from Florida, son. She's one of the last documented Oregon pythons, a subspecies we thought was extinct until we found her as a hatchling in 1985. She's been living in these forests for nearly 40 years. Officer Chen's expression shifted from cautious authority to intense scientific interest. "Ma'am, are you saying this is a native Oregon python?" "Because that would make this animal critically endangered, possibly the last of her kind." "I'm Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, retired head of herpetology at Oregon Zoo," Eleanor said with quiet dignity. "And yes, Serena represents a genetic line we've been trying to preserve for decades. Her eggs could be the key to preventing the complete extinction of her subspecies." The weight of this revelation settled over the clearing like a heavy blanket. Robert sank onto a fallen log, his face a mask of horror, as he realized he had spent 5 years hunting what might be one of the last examples of a dying species. His quest for revenge had nearly led him to commit what amounted to genocide. Sarah's phone buzzed again, Dr. Martinez's number insistent on the screen. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was Eleanor talking about preserving genetic lines and preventing extinction, while Sarah's own test results waited to potentially reveal cells gone rogue in her body. She declined the call again, but Tom noticed her distraction. "Sarah, take the call," he said gently. "We'll handle this." "Not now," she whispered. But Max looked up at her with those impossibly intelligent eyes, as if he understood that she was hiding from something important. He moved closer, pressing his warm body against her legs in the universal language of canine comfort. Officer Chen was photographing the scene with professional thoroughness, documenting the python, her eggs, and the scattered traps that Tom had gathered as evidence. "Mr. Mitchell," she addressed Robert, "I'm going to need a full statement about these traps and your activities in this area." "I'll tell you everything," Robert said quietly. "But first, I need you to understand something. 5 years ago, my 7-year-old daughter Emma was killed by a python at the Oregon Zoo. I thought it was an attack, a predator taking an innocent child. I've spent every day since then hunting pythons, thinking I was protecting other families from the same loss." He looked at his mother, his voice breaking. "I just learned that the python that killed Emma was Serena's offspring, and that my daughter's death was the result of human negligence, not animal aggression. I've been hunting an innocent species out of misdirected grief." Officer Chen lowered her camera, recognizing the depth of trauma in Robert's confession. "Sir, I appreciate your honesty, but illegal trapping of endangered species carries serious federal penalties. I have to—" "Wait," Eleanor interrupted, struggling to her feet with arthritic difficulty. "Before you arrest my son, I need to make a statement. I am the person responsible for Emma Mitchell's death. I was the senior keeper on duty that day, and I failed to secure the python enclosure properly. Everything Robert has done since then, every animal he's trapped, every law he's broken, it all stems from my cowardice in not taking responsibility for my mistake." The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of Serena's breathing and the distant approach of more sirens. Sarah realized that multiple emergency services were converging on their location, probably including media once word got out about the rare python birth. "Grandmother Eleanor," Sarah said softly, using the title she hadn't spoken in 3 years. "You can't take responsibility for Robert's choices. Grief makes us all do things we never thought possible." She thought about her own hidden grief. The baby she'd lost, the guilt she carried, the cancer scare she couldn't face. Everyone in this clearing was carrying secrets that had shaped their actions in ways both destructive and redemptive. Max chose that moment to do something extraordinary. He approached Serena slowly, his body language conveying no threat. The massive python's head rose to watch him, but instead of striking or coiling defensively, she simply observed. Max lay down next to her clutch of eggs, not touching them, but clearly positioning himself as an additional guardian. "My God," Eleanor whispered. "He understands. That little dog understands what those eggs represent." Officer Chen was filming now, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented. In 30 years of wildlife law enforcement, I've never seen interspecies cooperation like this. That dog is actively protecting a python's nest. Tom knelt beside Sarah, his own emotional walls cracking as he watched Max's extraordinary display of empathy. He knows what it's like to be abandoned, to be the only one left. He's not going to let those babies face the world alone. The first news van appeared at the tree line just as Sarah's phone rang again. This time, instead of Dr. Martinez's office, it was her friend Lisa from the local news station. Word was already spreading about the confrontation in the forest, and soon their private moment of reckoning would become a public spectacle. "Sarah," Eleanor said urgently, "before this gets out of hand, there's something else you need to know. The zoo has been searching for Serena for 2 years. When she escaped during that storm, we thought we'd lost the last hope for preserving her genetic line. If these eggs are viable, they represent a chance to bring a species back from the brink of extinction." Robert looked up with something approaching hope for the first time in years. "You mean, my hunting might not have been completely pointless? If I help protect her now, if I do everything I can to ensure those eggs survive—" "It won't bring Emma back," Eleanor said gently. "But it might give her death some meaning beyond the pain it's caused." Officer Chen was speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for backup from the zoo's reproductive specialists and requesting that the area be secured as a critical habitat zone. "This is now a federal protection site," she announced. "Nobody enters or leaves without authorization." Sarah watched the circus beginning to form around them and made a decision. She answered her phone. "Dr. Martinez?" "Yes, I'm ready for the results." She listened in silence while Tom, Robert, and Eleanor watched her face for any sign of what she was hearing. Max, still lying guard beside Serena's eggs, turned his head to look at her with those knowing eyes. "Thank you," she said finally, ending the call. The tests came back negative. No cancer. The symptoms were just stress and exhaustion from running the sanctuary. Tom pulled her into a fierce embrace, his relief evident in the way his hands shook as he held her. "Why didn't you tell me you were scared?" "Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing something else," she whispered against his chest. "After the baby, after Emma, after watching everyone around us carry so much grief, I just couldn't face the possibility of adding more loss to the pile." Eleanor overheard and approached them with trembling steps. "Sarah, honey, I know we haven't spoken properly since Emma's funeral. I know you blame me for tearing this family apart with my cowardice and lies, but watching you care for that damaged little dog, seeing how you've built something beautiful from broken pieces, it gives this old woman hope that healing is possible." The sound of more vehicles arriving interrupted the moment, but for the first time in years, the Mitchell-Wilson family was in the same place, speaking truth to each other, united by their shared commitment to protecting something precious and vulnerable. Serena had laid 2 more eggs, bringing her total to 8. Each one represented not just her offspring, but the possibility of species survival, the hope that extinction wasn't inevitable, that with enough care and protection, even the most endangered creatures could find their way back from the brink. As the media trucks arrived and the scientific teams prepared to establish a protection perimeter, Max maintained his vigil beside the python's nest, a living symbol of the truth that healing often comes from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can preserve the most precious forms of life. The morning light filtering through the Douglas firs took on an ominous quality as Dr. Amanda Rodriguez from Oregon Zoo's Reproductive Sciences Division arrived with her emergency team. What should have been a celebration of new life was rapidly becoming a crisis of extinction prevention. Serena's breathing had become labored, and her massive body showed signs of distress that Eleanor recognized with growing alarm. "She's egg-bound," Eleanor said quietly to Dr. Rodriguez as they observed the python from a safe distance. "The stress of being hunted, the unfamiliar presence of so many humans, it's interfering with the birthing process." Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly, her equipment cases already being unpacked by her assistants. "We have maybe an hour before we lose both the mother and the remaining eggs. The problem is, any intervention we attempt could trigger a defensive response that endangers everyone here." Sarah watched Max, who had not moved from his position beside Serena's partially completed nest. The puppy seemed to sense the urgency in the human voices around him, his ears swiveling toward each speaker while his eyes remained fixed on the struggling python. Bella had joined him now, her maternal instincts overriding her earlier trauma as she lay down parallel to Max, creating a living barrier between Serena and the growing crowd of officials. "We need to evacuate the area," Officer Chen announced, her voice carrying the authority of federal law. "This operation requires specialized equipment and minimal distractions." "No," Eleanor said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "Serena knows me. She's been stressed by strangers hunting her for months. If you want her to survive this, I need to be the one to help her." Robert stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Mom, you're 72 years old. Your arthritis, your heart condition. My granddaughter died because I failed in my duty as a keeper," Eleanor interrupted. "I will not let another life be lost because I chose safety over responsibility." Dr. Rodriguez looked between the elderly woman and the distressed python, calculating risks with the cold precision of someone who had spent her career making life-or-death decisions about endangered species. "Mrs. Mitchell, if something goes wrong, if she strikes or constricts, we might not be able to reach you in time." Eleanor was already moving toward her old Buick, retrieving a worn leather bag from the trunk. "I've been working with large constrictors since before you were born, young lady. This bag contains 40 years of experience and the tools I need to help Serena through this." As Eleanor approached the python, something remarkable happened. Serena's head rose to track her movement, but instead of the defensive posture she had maintained around everyone else, her body language shifted to something that could only be described as recognition and relief. A low, rumbling sound emerged from her throat, not a hiss, but something closer to a purr. "Hello, old girl," Eleanor whispered, kneeling beside the massive snake as if she were greeting a beloved pet. "I know it's been a long time, but I'm here now. Let's get these babies safely into the world." The transformation in both woman and python was immediate and profound. Eleanor's arthritic movements became fluid and confident as she fell back into the rhythm of work she had loved for decades. Serena's breathing steadied, her body relaxing as familiar hands began to gently examine her swollen midsection. Max and Bella watched this reunion with the intensity of creatures who understood they were witnessing something sacred. Sarah found herself holding her breath as Eleanor's weathered hands moved with surgical precision, feeling for the position of the trapped eggs. "There," Eleanor murmured, finding what she was looking for. 3 more eggs, positioned incorrectly. "Serena, I need you to trust me one more time." What followed was a masterclass in interspecies communication that left even Dr. Rodriguez speechless. Eleanor spoke to the python in a mixture of technical observation and gentle encouragement, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to make such requests. "Easy now, shift your weight to the left. That's it. Now contract gently. Good girl." But even as the first of the trapped eggs emerged successfully, the situation was deteriorating in ways that no one had anticipated. The media presence outside the protective perimeter was growing, and Sarah could hear the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching. Worse, Robert's former associates, The men who had fled earlier were on local news claiming that a dangerous snake was holding a family hostage in the Oregon wilderness. "We've got incoming," Tom announced grimly, monitoring emergency frequencies on his Ranger radio. Multiple agencies responding to reports of a hostage situation involving a 20-foot python and several civilians. Officer Chen was frantically calling her superiors, trying to clarify the situation before armed response teams arrived and turned a delicate birthing process into a bloodbath. "This is Chen at the Cascade Creek site. Negative on the hostage situation. Repeat, negative on hostage situation. We have a successful endangered species birth in progress." But her words were lost in the chaos of miscommunication and sensationalized reporting. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Sarah realized with horror that law enforcement officers expecting to find a dangerous animal situation might shoot first and ask questions later. "Eleanor," Dr. Rodriguez called urgently, "we need to move faster. If armed responders arrive—" "I can't rush this," Eleanor replied without looking up from her work. "The second egg is malpositioned. If I move too quickly, it could rupture, killing both the baby and potentially Serena." Max seemed to sense the approaching danger in a way that transcended human understanding. He rose from his protective position and moved to the edge of the clearing, his small body rigid with tension as he stared toward the forest where the sound of engines grew louder. Then, in a moment that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life, everything went wrong at once. The first SWAT vehicle burst through the tree line with tactical precision, followed immediately by two more. Officers in full riot gear emerged with weapons drawn, their training telling them to neutralize any threat to civilian safety. From their perspective, they saw exactly what they had been told to expect: a massive python surrounded by several adults and children in immediate danger. "Everyone down! Get away from the snake!" The lead officer's voice boomed through a megaphone, amplified and distorted by the forest acoustics. The sudden noise and commotion triggered exactly the response Dr. Rodriguez had feared. Serena, already stressed by the difficult birth, perceived the armed humans as an immediate threat to her vulnerable eggs. Her massive body coiled defensively around the nest, and her head rose to face the perceived attackers. Eleanor, caught between the python and the advancing officers, found herself in the worst possible position. "Wait," she called to the SWAT team. "She's not attacking. She's protecting her babies." But her words were lost in the tactical chatter and shouted commands. The lead officer, seeing an elderly woman apparently trapped by a massive constrictor, made the decision that his training demanded. "Taking the shot," he announced, raising his rifle toward Serena's head. In that split second, as Eleanor watched in horror and Dr. Rodriguez screamed for them to stop, Max made a choice that defied every instinct of self-preservation. The puppy, who had been terrorized and abused for the first months of his life, who had every reason to fear humans with weapons, launched himself directly into the line of fire. His small body interposed itself between the rifle and Serena's head just as the officer squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the forest like thunder, and Max collapsed into the creek with a splash that seemed to stop time itself. Sarah's scream of anguish joined Eleanor's wail of grief as the puppy who had risked everything to save his family paid the ultimate price for his courage. Serena's response was immediate and terrifying. Her massive body uncoiled with explosive force, and she struck toward the officers with the fury of a mother protecting her young. The clearing erupted into chaos as humans scattered and weapons were raised, but all Sarah could see was Max's small form lying motionless in the shallow water, his blood mixing with the creek that had witnessed so much pain and revelation. The puppy who had survived fighting rings and abandonment, who had learned to love again despite every reason for fear, who had just that morning shown them all what courage looked like, was gone. The forest fell into a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Sarah's scream died in her throat as she stared at Max's motionless form in the creek, the water around him tinged with red. The SWAT officers froze, their weapons still raised but their confidence shattered by the realization of what had just occurred. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Officer Chen's voice cut through the paralysis, her federal authority overriding the tactical team's protocols. "Stand down immediately." Eleanor crawled toward the creek on her hands and knees, her arthritic joints forgotten in the face of overwhelming grief. "Max, baby, no," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of another innocent life lost to the violence that seemed to follow her family. "Not you too." Tom reached the puppy first, his military medic training taking over as he lifted Max's limp body from the water. Blood seeped from a wound in the dog's shoulder, but as Tom's fingers found the pulse point in Max's neck, his eyes widened with disbelief. "He's alive," Tom announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "The bullet grazed him, but he's alive." Sarah collapsed beside her husband, her hands trembling as she examined Max's wound. The bullet had torn through the puppy's shoulder muscle, missing vital organs by mere inches. It was serious, potentially crippling but not fatal. "We need to get him to the emergency vet clinic immediately." But as they prepared to move Max, something extraordinary happened that would be talked about for decades to come. Serena, instead of continuing her defensive posture against the armed officers, began to move toward the injured puppy. Her massive head lowered to within inches of Max's face, and a sound emerged from her throat, a low, keening cry that sounded remarkably like mourning. "Doctor." Rodriguez, who had been documenting everything with scientific precision, lowered her camera with shaking hands. "In 40 years of studying reptile behavior, I've never seen anything like this. She's grieving for him." The lead SWAT officer, a 20-year veteran named Sergeant Morrison, slowly lowered his weapon as the full scope of what had transpired became clear. We were told there was a hostage situation. The report said a dangerous snake was threatening civilians." "The only dangerous thing here," Eleanor said with quiet fury as she struggled to her feet, "was the fear and ignorance that turned a miracle into a tragedy." Her eyes blazed with an anger that had been building for 5 years. "This puppy risked his life to save a mother giving birth, and you shot him for it." Robert stepped forward, his face twisted with guilt and recognition. "Sergeant, I think my former associates may have called in false reports. They were angry about losing a profitable capture, and they knew that claiming a public safety threat would bring an armed response." The weight of this revelation settled over the clearing like a toxic cloud. The entire armed response had been triggered by the spite of men who saw dollar signs where others saw life, who were willing to weaponize law enforcement to settle their grievances. Max stirred in Tom's arms, his eyes fluttering open to focus on Sarah's tear-stained face. Despite his pain, his tail attempted a weak wag, and he struggled to lift his head toward Serena's nest. Even wounded, his first concern was for the eggs he had been protecting. "Shh, baby," Sarah whispered, gently restraining him. "The eggs are safe. You did good, Max. You did so good." But the crisis was far from over. The stress of the gunshot and commotion had triggered complications in Serena's labor, and Dr. Rodriguez was working frantically to save both mother and remaining eggs. "Eleanor, I need your help. She's going into shock and I can't get close enough to assist." Eleanor looked between the injured puppy and the struggling python, her face reflecting the impossible choice between two creatures who needed her expertise. "Sarah, can you handle Max's immediate care? I have training as a veterinary assistant. Go, Sarah said firmly. "Help her finish what we started." What followed was a desperate race against time as two species fought for survival with the help of humans who had finally learned to see beyond their own fears and prejudices. Eleanor worked with Serena while Dr. Rodriguez provided medical support. Their combined decades of experience focused on bringing new life safely into the world. Tom commandeered one of the SWAT vehicles to rush Max to the emergency veterinary clinic in town, leaving Sarah to coordinate between the medical teams and the growing crowd of officials who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had almost destroyed. Officer Chen was on her radio, her voice tight with controlled anger as she demanded an investigation into how false reports had triggered an armed response against endangered wildlife. "I want to know who called this in and what their motivations were. We nearly caused an extinction event because someone wanted revenge." Sergeant Morrison approached Sarah with the awkward posture of a man unaccustomed to apologies. "Ma'am, I need you to know that we followed protocol based on the information we received. But seeing that dog, what he did, I've never seen courage like that from any creature, human or animal." Sarah looked at the man who had nearly killed the puppy she loved more than her own life and found herself thinking about Max's capacity for forgiveness despite his traumatic past. "Sergeant, Max was bred for fighting, trained to be vicious, and treated with unimaginable cruelty for the first months of his life. But when he came to us, he chose love over fear, protection over revenge. Maybe we could all learn something from that." The breakthrough came just as the afternoon light began to fade. Eleanor's voice rose in triumph as the final egg emerged successfully, bringing Serena's total to 11 viable eggs, more than any recorded birth of her subspecies in over 30 years. 11 babies, Eleanor announced to the clearing, tears streaming down her face. 11 chances to bring a species back from extinction. Serena, exhausted but victorious, arranged her massive body protectively around the complete clutch. Her breathing steadied, and the dangerous stress indicators that had threatened her life began to normalize. She had survived the ordeal and successfully reproduced against odds that seemed impossible just hours earlier. But the most extraordinary moment came when Tom returned from the veterinary clinic with Max, the puppy's shoulder bandaged, but his spirit unbroken. As Tom carried him back to the nest site, Max's eyes immediately sought out Serena and her eggs. The reunion between the injured puppy and the python mother created a tableau that defied every expectation about natural enemies and species boundaries. Max resumed his protective position near the eggs, while Serena's massive head lowered to gently touch the puppy's uninjured shoulder, a gesture of gratitude that transcended the language barriers between mammal and reptile. "They're bonded now," Dr. Rodriguez observed with scientific wonder. "That python recognizes Max as part of her family unit. She'll defend him as fiercely as she defends her own offspring." Eleanor sat heavily on a fallen log, the day's emotional and physical toll evident in every line of her face. "Robert," she called to her son, who had been standing in silent contemplation at the edge of the clearing. "Do you understand now? Do you see what we almost lost?" Robert approached the nest slowly, his eyes taking in the scene of interspecies cooperation that directly contradicted everything he had believed about pythons for the past 5 years. "Mom, I've spent so long seeing these animals as monsters that I forgot they're just mothers trying to protect their babies, just like Emma would have been trying to protect hers if she'd lived to have children." The parallel wasn't lost on anyone present. Emma Mitchell, the 7-year-old girl whose death had started this cycle of revenge and misunderstanding, would have been 12 now, old enough to understand the miracle they were witnessing, old enough to appreciate the courage of a puppy who risked everything to protect life rather than destroy it. As the sun set over the Oregon forest, casting golden light through the trees onto a scene of unexpected harmony, Sarah received a text from the veterinary clinic. The X-rays showed that Max's shoulder would heal completely with proper care and physical therapy. There would be no permanent damage, no lasting disability from his act of heroism. "He's going to be fine," she announced to the group, her voice breaking with relief. "Max is going to be just fine." The puppy in question looked up at his name, his tail wagging weakly but persistently. Despite everything he had endured, the fighting ring, the abandonment, the shooting, his capacity for joy remained unbroken. He had found his purpose in protecting others, and no amount of pain could diminish the satisfaction of a job well done. Serena's eggs would incubate for the next 60 days under the careful supervision of the zoo's reproductive team, representing hope for a species that had been on the brink of extinction. But more importantly, they represented the triumph of understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict, and love over the cycle of violence that had claimed too many innocent lives. 3 months later, the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as Sarah stood on the porch of what had once been Eleanor's foreclosure-threatened farmhouse, now the headquarters of the Cascade Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as a tragic confrontation in the forest had blossomed into something beautiful and healing. Max bounded across the yard with his characteristic enthusiasm, his shoulder completely healed except for a small scar that had become a badge of honor. Behind him followed an unlikely procession. Bella, of course, but also 3 of Serena's successfully hatched offspring, each no bigger than a garden snake but already showing the intelligence and calm temperament of their mother. "Would you look at that?" Eleanor laughed from her chair on the porch, her voice stronger than it had been in years. The foreclosure had been stopped when the state of Oregon purchased her property to establish the sanctuary, and Eleanor had been hired as the head curator at a salary that allowed her to live comfortably while doing work she loved. Tom emerged from the barn where he'd been working with Dr. Rodriguez to prepare the specialized habitat for Serena and her babies. The adult python had become a local celebrity, with school groups and researchers traveling from across the country to observe the remarkable interspecies relationship she had developed with Max and Bella. "The Japanese documentary crew wants to film again tomorrow," Tom called to Sarah. "They're particularly interested in Max's protective behavior with the hatchlings." Robert walked up the gravel driveway, his arms full of groceries for the weekly family dinner that had become their new tradition. His plea agreement with federal prosecutors had resulted in community service and a substantial fine, but more importantly, it had included a provision requiring him to work with the sanctuary for 2 years. The man who had once hunted pythons now spent his days caring for the very animals he had sought to destroy. "Any word from the adoption families?" Sarah asked as they gathered on the porch. Eleanor smiled, consulting the tablet that had replaced her old paper records. 3 more of Serena's babies have been placed with accredited breeding programs. We've got genetic diversity spanning 4 states now, and the species survival plan coordinators say we've essentially saved the Oregon python from extinction. As the sun set behind the Douglas firs, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Max curled up beside Serena's outdoor enclosure, maintaining the vigil that had become his life's purpose. The puppy who had once known only fear and pain now spent his days protecting new life, teaching everyone who met him that courage comes not from the absence of fear, but from choosing love despite it. In the distance, a family of deer grazed peacefully in the meadow, unaware that they shared their home with one of conservation's greatest success stories, a place where broken hearts had learned to heal, where enemies had become family, and where a small dog's act of heroism had saved an entire species from vanishing forever. The Wilson Mitchell family was finally whole. Dear friends, Max's story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, even when life has dealt us the harshest blows. Like many of us who've raised families, buried parents, and watched grandchildren grow, the characters in this tale discovered that healing often comes from the most unexpected places. Eleanor, at 72, found purpose again after years of guilt and isolation. Sarah learned that hiding from fear only amplifies it, while Tom and Robert discovered that true strength lies in forgiveness, not revenge. Max, despite his traumatic past, chose love over fear every single day, a lesson that speaks to anyone who's ever wondered if their painful experiences have meaning. This little German shepherd's courage saved not just his family, but an entire species from extinction, proving that our smallest acts of kindness can have the most profound impact. In our golden years, when we sometimes feel forgotten or useless, Max's story whispers a powerful truth. We all have something precious left to protect, someone who still needs our wisdom, and love that can still change the world. Sometimes the family that heals us isn't the one we were born into, but the one we choose to create through compassion and understanding. Discussion questions. Have you ever experienced an unexpected friendship that changed your perspective on life, similar to Max and Serena's bond? What second chance moment in your own life taught you the most about forgiveness and healing? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter and inspire others in our community.